Good day. I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me again this day here in the library. I would like to think with you and reflect with you out loud about my relationship and the performance of General Benjamin Franklin Butler. He's an interesting character. General Butler was named after Benjamin Franklin, the founding father, and his brother Andrew, older brother, I should say, Andrew, was named after Andrew Jackson. So his father was patriotic, although his father was a privateer in the service of the country and died of yellow fever in the Caribbean shortly after Ben Butler was born. But Ben Butler was born on November the 5th of 1818 in Deerfield, New Hampshire. He was the youngest of 6 children. And his mother was a devout Christian, some say Calvinist and some say Baptist, but she wanted Ben to go into the priesthood and be a minister. They encouraged reading. The family was very literate. And at age 9, young Ben went to Phillips Exeter Academy, but he only lasted there a term. And he was, some say sent home, others say went home, for being irascible, fighting, obstinate, oppositional. The boy didn't want to be at Exeter Academy. And as he matured, he read, learned, and was an avid reader and student. He went to Colby College in Massachusetts, not too far south of where he grew up, and matriculated there, and he graduated in 1838. Now, his mother, as I had said, wanted Ben to be a minister, but that held no charms for Ben. He instead began to read law there in Colby, and in 1840, after just 2 years, he passed the bar exam and became an attorney. He's a very astute attorney, an intricate, well-functioning legal mind that would complement his less than attractive physical appearance. Ben Butler has strabismus in his left eye and a droopy eyelid, and his left eye is almost closed. He doesn't have much of a neck, very heavily built, not an attractive man, but he did pass the bar in 1840. He then, in building his law practice, served a term or 2 in the Massachusetts state legislature as a representative, and then served a term as a Massachusetts state senator. And along the way, in 1843, Ben began to get involved with the Massachusetts militia, rising in 1855 to the lofty rank of brigadier general. And it was when the war began, it was an idea to him to join the first of the Massachusetts regiments that were going to Washington City, but there hadn't been a brigadier general of U.S. volunteers appointed yet. So he had made acquaintance with Secretary of War at that time, Simon Cameron, and Simon Cameron recommended him to the president to be an appointee as a brigadier general of volunteers. Butler also appealed to the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Andrew. And between Simon Cameron and Governor Andrew, Ben Butler was appointed brigadier general of volunteers. Now, he was one of the first of the brigadier generals. I, too, was appointed the brigadier general of volunteers, and many others right there in the beginning of the war. But he had an early on appointment. He then was sent, General Scott, Winfield Scott, who was still commander, general-in-chief, sent Butler to Annapolis, Maryland. And there was right across the river there from very near to Baltimore. And there'd been the Pratt Street riot just a few days before Butler got there. And Maryland was very contentious. Maryland was rumbling about seceding. So Butler gets there, Brigadier General Butler gets to Annapolis, immediately puts it under martial law, then goes with his concern for Maryland, which way it would go. He went back across the ferry to Baltimore and immediately placed it under martial law. Well, this greatly upset President Lincoln, not to mention General Winfield Scott, because Butler had not been ordered to do what he did with Baltimore. He's supposed to be in Maryland. But he went over to Baltimore, puts it under martial law, caused the president a great deal of heartburn, because you see, at this point, early on in the war, he's trying to keep as many states as possible in the Union. And the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were not only desirable to remain in the Union for men, materiel, and keeping the country together, they were also a border, a defensive zone between the U.S. and the Deep South, what was known as the Deep South states, going all the way to the Gulf and to the Atlantic Ocean. And to have one of those states leave the Union would be disastrous for President Lincoln. And here's Butler putting Baltimore under martial law. Furthermore, he threatened the Maryland state legislature, which was rumbling about seceding, and he said he'd take action against them if they did secede, and even seized, some say stole, the state seal, the official state seal. So if they did pass the legislation of secession, it could not be made, in Butler's eyes, official. Well, after that hoopla and hubbub was calmed down, General Scott sent Benjamin Franklin Butler to Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula there, and I think possibly to keep him out of trouble because he was under the command of another general. But he was also then promoted to Major General of Volunteers. So now, Major General Ben Butler is the highest ranking general of volunteers in the Army out of the 178 political generals that President Lincoln appointed from May of 1861. Butler is the highest ranking general of volunteers in the Army and remains so for the rest of the war. In fact, when he and I were in the field together, he was second only to me in command, and when I was not present with him, wherever his army might be, ultimately the Army of the James, he was the commanding officer for the area. And this caused some great consternation and concern later. But he's sent off to Fort Monroe, and hopefully where he could do no damage. But it's almost as soon as he gets there, on April the 23rd, Virginia seceded on April 17th. The hammer fell and they left the Union. And there was some rumbling about contraband or a slave rebellion. So General Butler took it on himself to write a letter to the Maryland governor offering help to quell a possible slave rebellion, and he said, His Excellency Thomas H. Hicks, Governor of the state of Maryland, I have understood within the last hour that some apprehensions were entertained of an insurrection of the Negro population of this neighborhood. I am anxious to convince all classes of persons that the forces under my command are not here in any way to interfere with or countenance any interference with the laws of the state. I am therefore ready to cooperate with Your Excellency in suppressing most promptly and effectively any insurrection against the laws of Maryland. And I have the honor to be Your Excellency's obedient servant, B.F. Butler, General of the 3rd Brigade. And that was in April the 23rd of 1861. Now this was another rather large rock in a placid pool, causing a great many ripples and repercussions, and once again the President is rolling his eyes and wringing his hands, and General Scott is more than a little disturbed about General Butler far exceeding his authority as even a major general. He could not legitimately do that, caused a great deal of consternation, but ultimately that was calmed down. Now Butler had been a very successful attorney in civilian life, and he had, as I had said earlier, he had a great legal mind. He had no military experience. Yes, he'd been with the Virginia or the Massachusetts State Militia since '43, some 18 years, but he was in charge of riot control. That's where he trained, and security matters. So he had certainly no hard military experience and no combat experience. And here he is about to touch off complications with Baltimore and Maryland, the state of Maryland leaving. Then he goes back to Fort Monroe and he offers to use U.S. forces in putting down a slave rebellion, and that was far, far exceeding his authority. But another matter that he did when he was there at Fort Monroe, there were 3 slaves on one particular occasion that came over escaped from Confederate works, I believe Sewell's works, just across the river in clear, plain sight of the garrison at Fort Monroe. Confederates were building emplacements and fortifications. Slaves had been slipping away consistently and into our lines, and that was causing 2 problems. What do we do with them? Because the Fugitive Slave Act, both of the Fugitive Slave Acts, going back to 1850 and the Great Compromise, were still in effect. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Act was not repealed until June, I believe the 27th or 28th of '64. So we fought almost the whole war with the Fugitive Slave Act, federal law requiring the returning of slaves, in effect. So when the war starts, that's a problem because we're supposed to be returning slaves if they run away and get into our property or our camps. The other problem is much larger. President Lincoln was trying to develop a format or a procedure in dealing with the South regarding runaway slaves without recognizing that the South was a sovereign country in and of itself. How to deal with the slavery matter of runaway slaves and not return them, yet not recognize the South as an independent country. And we didn't want to return them, but the law is the law. They've been coming into Butler's works there at Fort Monroe, and I think he finally took a stand with the 3 that came in on a particular night. He comes into the office in the morning. He's told at report that 3 have come in. They speak their piece. They wanted to meet with him. He agreed to meet with them. And now he's the commanding general there at the fort. And he listened to the 3 of them, and they were about to be sold south. And 2 of them had families there in the area, and they did not want to be sold south. So they made the ultimate decision to run away and didn't want to go back. Ben Butler didn't want to send them back. So when the colonel owning them sent a messenger over and demanded that they be returned, Butler refused, and he was told, well, the Fugitive Slave Act requires that you return our property. And Butler said, if I understand you correctly, that you are with the state of Virginia and are a separate country, then the laws of the United States do not apply to you. Therefore, you have no suit. You have no complaint. Well, this stymied the Confederate, I believe it was a major, and also indicated that apparently Butler had given a great deal of thought to this, and he had conjured up at that time, a legal fiction. There were no laws to support what he contended after that. There was no constitutional authority that supported what he did, but he declared that they were contraband of war because they were property. At that time, they were still property as slaves. He had seen them working on fortifications that would be used against the United States. They were not performing agricultural services or any domestic services. They were being used to build fortifications of war against the United States. And Butler felt that nullified their slavery status. So when they escaped and came over within federal lines, they would be considered contrabands of war, as any other property that might be captured by the United States and deprived from the South using it against us, and us, if possible, using it against the South. And this caused, again, great consternation with President Lincoln, because he'd been thinking about how to handle this and wrestling with the legal dilemma and the international dilemma that he didn't want to become international because he did not want to recognize the Confederacy as a separate country. But it forced him to make a decision, and he supported, through the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, this move about contraband of war, and that we would use them in our fortifications and in other duties, and we would pay them. Now, on May the 27th of 1861, Ben Butler sent this to the commander of the Department of Virginia and to the General-in-Chief of the Army, and it outlines his thinking and states plainly what he was thinking, and I think it merits my reading his letter. May 27th of 61, Fortress Monroe, Virginia. Sir, since I wrote my last dispatch, the question in regard to slave property is becoming one of very serious magnitude. The inhabitants of Virginia are using their Negroes in the batteries and are preparing to send the women and children south. The escapes from them are very numerous, and a squad has come in this morning to my pickets bringing their women and children. Of course, these cannot be dealt with upon the theory on which I designed to treat the services of able-bodied men and women who might come within my lines, and of which I gave you a detailed account in my last dispatch. I am in the utmost doubt what to do with this species of property. Up to this time, I have had come within my lines men and women with their children, entire families, each family belonging to the same owner. I have therefore determined to employ, as I can do very profitably, the able-bodied persons in the party, issuing proper food for the support of all, and charging against their services the expense of care and sustenance of the non-laborers, keeping a strict and accurate account, as well of the services as of the expenditures, having the worth of the services and the cost of the expenditure determined by a board of survey hereafter to be detailed. I know of no other manner in which to dispose of this subject and the questions connected therewith. As a matter of property to the insurgents, it will be a very great moment, the number that I now have amounting, as I am informed, to what in good times will be of the value of $60,000. 12 of these Negroes, I am informed, have escaped from the erection of the batteries on Sewell's Point, which this morning fired upon my expedition as it passed by out of range. As a means of offense, therefore, in the enemy's hands, these Negroes, when able-bodied, are of the last importance. Without them, the batteries could not have been erected, at least for many weeks. As a military question, it would seem to be a measure of necessity to deprive their masters of their services. And how can this be done? As a political question, and a question of humanity, can I receive the services of a father and a mother and not take the children? Of the humanitarian aspect, I have no doubt. Of the political one, I have no right to judge. I therefore submit all this to your letter or your better judgment, and as these questions have a political aspect, I have ventured, and I trust I am not wrong in so doing, to duplicate the parts of my dispatch relating to this subject and forward them to the Secretary of War. Well, quite a bombshell, but it outlines what he wanted to do, and in fact stipulates they've been working, the contraband that came in had of late been working on the Sewell's battery that had indeed fired on federal troops. And he provides for the payment of for the services to provide for the food and nourishment and sustenance of the non-workers, the non-combatant women and children. Now, on May 30th of '61, just a few days later, Secretary of War Simon Cameron gave this reply. Washington, May 30th, '61. Major General Butler: Sir, your action in respect to the Negroes who came in your lines from the service of the rebels is approved. That is significant. He goes on to say, the department is sensible of the embarrassment which must surround officers conducting military operations in a state by the laws of which slavery is sanctioned. The government cannot recognize the rejection by any state of its federal obligations, nor can it refuse the performance of the federal obligations resting upon itself. Among these federal obligations, however, none can be more important than that of suppressing and dispersing armed combinations formed for the purpose of overthrowing its whole constitutional authority. While, therefore, you will permit no interference by the persons under your command with the relations of persons held to service under the laws of any state, you will, on the other hand, so long as any state within which your military operations are conducted is under the control of such armed combinations, refrain from surrendering to alleged masters any persons who may come within your lines. You will employ such persons in the service to which they may be best adapted. Keep an account of the labor by them performed, of the value of it, and of the expense of their maintenance. The question of their final disposition will be reserved for future determination. Simon Cameron, Secretary of War. So here it is. The President has sanctioned it and sent message through the Secretary of War that we are not to send Negroes or runaways, now called contraband, back to Confederate lines, in spite of the fugitive slave law that has been circumvented, and will keep those slaves and families indeed who come into our lines. And the President holds in his hands what the ultimate resolution will be, and the Secretary refers and says the question of their final disposition will be reserved for future determination. So the president will hold those matters within his own hands. So now we have a sort of policy that if slaves run away and get into our lines, we will keep them, gainfully employ them, pay them, and they will therefore pay for their own sustenance and housing. And the president will begin to seriously deal with what will be the ultimate decision on how to handle runaway slaves. And the fugitive slave law is still in effect, as I said, will be so until June of 1864. Now after that, Butler is then sent to New Orleans. Admiral Farragut has taken New Orleans. It's occupied and fallen, and Butler is sent down there to work with Farragut to be the military governor of New Orleans. Well, it would seem that General Butler maintains his model of how he operates, his modus operandi. And when he got to New Orleans, he first of all immediately hangs one of the citizens, a William Mumford. Now he's somebody whose name has slipped been between the pages into the binding of history books. But William Mumford was a Confederate devotee. And when he had the opportunity after Butler is military governor, he went on top of one of the buildings in New Orleans and jerked down the United States flag. Butler unilaterally and on his own hanged Mr. Mumford for treason and other charges. That caused quite a controversy. There was some concern about some rebellion there in New Orleans. I would like to add, though, that Butler paid for his funeral and saw to it that the widow Mumford was cared for, and in fact after the war saw to it that she had employment and was taken care of financially. I think he had some regret over having acted possibly hastily. But he hanged one of the local citizens. He also got into some disputes and disagreements with the consulates there from various countries because loyal Confederates or Confederate sympathizers, men of wealth, were putting money into the consulates of foreign countries, for several of them, specifically the French consulate and the Dutch consulate. And Butler resented this and took actions to confiscate that money. Well, as you can imagine, that set off some international repercussions. And two things happened. Reverdy Johnson was appointed as a special inspector to come down to New Orleans and look into the matter. He was a dedicated enemy of Butler, another Democrat. Butler was a Democrat. Oh, and he inspected the matter, investigated, and came to resolve that the money should be returned. And Butler reluctantly returned the money he confiscated, but to the point of what Butler was doing, $400,000 of what went back to, I believe, the French consulate there, we know ultimately wound up $400,000 in Cuba buying uniforms for Confederate soldiers. So Butler was correct in what he was thinking. He was not correct in what he did. He took it upon himself as a military governor to get into the financial monies and affairs of foreign governments in New Orleans. That was not something he could do as a military governor. It was a civilian matter, and he caused a serious international incident. Of course, he was also accused of stealing silverware from the different homes he was in, confiscating that. just generally wreaking havoc wherever he went. And he was then disturbed because the women of New Orleans, most of the men were gone. The only men there were, only males were old men and boys for the most part. They were showing open disdain for federal troops, particularly officers. In fact, reports of them spitting on federal officers and even doing worse. It was suggested that they were actually waiting for federal officers in the quarter and other areas where there were balconies, and federal officers or naval officers would be walking, that they would wait and dump the contents of their chamber pots in the mornings on the heads of federal officers and naval officers. It came to a head, though, when the contents of a chamber pot were dumped on the head of Admiral David Farragut. That was the end of the matter. And General Butler issued what is now the infamous General Order number 28. And it says, New Orleans, May 15, 1862. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. This set off an uproar. Jefferson Davis declared him a criminal. Even Lord Palmerston in Britain declared that it was an obscene insult and demanded of President Lincoln that it be rescinded and apologies made and so forth. So Butler became known as Beast Butler. One result, well, there were two results. One, they straightened up. The women did not any longer dump chamber pots on heads of federal soldiers or sailors, and they did get a little nicer in their demeanor. But one thing that they did was they made chamber pots with General Butler's image in the bottom. I believe that you might be able to see his image. I certainly hope so. I told General Butler I thought it to be a very good image of him. The location of his picture was not altogether suitable to General Butler, but I thought it to be a very good likeness of the man. So, as you can see, it was a gift. I did not seek it out. I have a Butler chamber pot. They're also known by other names, none of which I will go into here. So, Butler had chamber pots with his picture in the bottom, and you may use your own thoughts and imagination as to why the picture was there. Well, Butler is then recalled and sent, he's replaced by Nathaniel Banks. And when he demanded why, he was not told why. When he demanded to know why, President Lincoln said, I don't know why, and I will not tell you why, and I won't tell you who's requested you be transferred. You've been relieved by General Banks and go back to your home in Massachusetts and await further orders. Well, he went back and he got those further orders. He was once again sent to Fort Monroe and made the department commander of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. And that became, when I took command, the Army of the James. Now, General Butler performed less than what I would have had him do. He was to move as part of my grand strategy when we moved in May of '64, to go down the James and take Petersburg from the southeast, while the rest of the army moved from the northwest, and he failed to do so. He stopped short of Petersburg, and by this time, when he goes into camp and stops, PGT Beauregard, General Beauregard, has been released from his purgatory or banishment down in the southeastern coast of the country in the Confederacy, and he is brought into Virginia, and he leads Old Men and Boys, a small force, and defeats Butler at the Battle of Brewery's Bluff. And Butler is then bottled up at Bermuda 100 between two rivers, and I characterize it as being as secure in a jug as if a cork was put in the top of the jug. And essentially I lost the use of the Army of the James. We drew off soldiers from them, and we were able to use them to some extent, but for the most part and for all practical purposes, he is out of action. And then going into the last days before we went into siege, I sent him again down to Petersburg, and he stopped short of Petersburg, did not go in. He could have taken it. And then between the 15th and the 18th of June of '64, he stalls, and Robert E. Lee then gets the Army of Northern Virginia into the trenches between our forces and Petersburg, and by the 18th of June, we're locked into a siege. So I have a siege that I did not want. Butler is bottled up at Bermuda 100, and I'm just not happy with his performance. I was recommending his relief, but President Lincoln would not do it. He could not do it because Lincoln, well, he was a Democrat at the time. Butler was a Democrat. President Lincoln was elected by a split Democratic Party. John Breckinridge for the Southern Democratic Party, and Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democratic Party. That split let Lincoln get in the White House with less than 40% of the vote. Butler, being a Democrat, was necessary for Lincoln. Butler had even gone to the convention in 1860 and had originally supported Jefferson Davis to be the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. That didn't work, and he switched to John C. Breckinridge. So he was no friend of Lincoln. Butler was not. But Lincoln had to have Butler to support him since he was such a strong Democrat. And he would not relieve him. Now, when we got into December, early December of '64, Sherman's coming up the southeastern coast, approaching Savannah. I was wanting to capture the port there at Wilmington, Delaware, and going into take that Fort Fisher there, because it was the closest to Wilmington, Delaware, and the supply line for Lee there at Petersburg. But it was by this time getting to be I believe the last port blockade runners could go into, and I wanted to take it. I was going to send Godfrey Weitzel in to command that force, combined force between Weitzel in the Army and David Dixon Porter with the Navy. When Butler, and this is under Butler's command, when he found out about this, he comes to me and demanded to be put in command of the expedition. He was the ranking officer, in fact, second only to me. I could not turn him down. And he had heard of an idea that he wanted to fill a barge or a ship full of powder, push it up close to Fort Fisher, and detonate it and destroy the fort. Well, for 3 weeks, from December the 6th to December 23rd, 24th, I kept pressing him to move, and he would not, one reason or another. I need this, I need that, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And Porter is getting aggravated with him because Porter has no respect for him. And finally, on December, I think 25th, Butler moves on Fort Fisher. They moved the old Louisiana, filled with, I think, 2,000 tons of black powder. And I had no inkling of any hope this would succeed. I told that to Sherman in a letter. They finally, in desperation, they push it up. It doesn't do any damage to the fort. Forces land. Weitzel goes ashore, and he tells Butler the fort's not damaged particularly, and Butler calls everybody back. Butler never got on the ground himself, which I bitterly criticize him for. And he calls everyone back on the ships. I had ordered, once on the ground, do not retreat. So Butler pulls them all back in and sails back to port with no success at all. I was not happy with that. And I then appointed General Terry to take the fort. He sailed on January 6th. January 7th, Fort Fisher fell. Just that quickly. I then recommended to President Lincoln that he replace Butler. Secretary of War Stanton immediately relieved Butler of command. Butler agreed to go quietly for a couple of reasons. He had clout with President Lincoln. In fact, in the summer of '64, when President Lincoln was putting together his campaign, he offered the vice presidency to Benjamin Butler. Before he offered it to Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, Lincoln offered the vice presidency position to Ben Butler. And Butler turned it down. In fact, wrote a letter. Simon Cameron had been sent by Lincoln to feel Butler out. Butler made this reply: "Please say to Mr. Lincoln that while I appreciate with the fullest sensibilities his act of friendship and the high compliment he pays me, yet I must decline. Tell him that I said laughingly that with the prospects of a campaign before me, I would not quit the field to be a vice president even with himself as president unless he would give me bond and sureties in the full sum of his 4 years' salary, that within 3 months after his inauguration he will die unresigned." End quote. So you see now that if Ben Butler had accepted President Abraham Lincoln's offer to be vice president, even though he said it within 3 months after the inauguration, he'll die unresigned, Benjamin Butler would have been the president of the United States. I think he probably thought about that often. Nevertheless, Ben Butler came very close to being the president of the United States, but he was so confident of his ability in the field that he turned down the offer. And President Lincoln was probably relieved too, because even though he wanted a Democrat in the tent with him running for the presidency, he said this about Ben Butler: "Butler is as full of poison gas as a dead dog." So President Lincoln relieved him, probably with some pleasure. Butler agreed to go quietly, though, because he insisted that if Jefferson Davis was tried for treason, that he would be named the chief prosecutor for the trial of Jefferson Davis. And President Lincoln agreed to this. So Butler went home. Unfortunately, President Lincoln was murdered just days after he was inaugurated, from March 4th to April 15th. And Butler had not been his vice president and did not become president of the United States. And fortunately, Jefferson Davis was never tried for treason, or whatever charges might have been put against him, and Butler therefore did not have the opportunity to be the chief prosecutor. Many things happened with General Benjamin Franklin Butler during the war and before the war in his life, but I've covered the serious matters that I had with General Butler. So I think at this time I should bring my remarks to a close. Thank you for joining me here in the library as I thought out loud with you about my relationship politically and militarily with General Benjamin F. Butler. I look forward to being with you again another time when you join me in the library or my parlor or my study, and I reflect about someone with whom I was closely associated in the war. For the moment, I bid you a fond adieu. I'm Lieutenant General Grant, and I'm saying goodbye.